Usually when we talk about medical diagnosis,
Mm.
there's this underlying expectation of precision.
Right, yeah, like it's mechanical engineering or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You fall off your bike, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that stark, jagged white line across the bone, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is.
It's a very comforting binary, The fracture is either there or it isn't. You can see it with your own eyes. And because you can see it, you immediately know the next steps to fix it. We crave that kind of visibility.
We really do, especially when it comes to the systems designed to protect our health.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then you step out of the emergency room and into the world of massive, national data sets, specifically the world of pharmacovigilance and public health surveillance. And suddenly that crisp, high-definition X-ray machine it's completely broken.
Oh, it's shattered. Yeah.
Right. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky, filled with millions of overlapping data points. And when you look closely at that landscape, it presents this genuinely terrifying question. What happens when the sheer volume of data that's meant to protect you actually blinds the experts to potential danger?
It's a paradox, really. We always assume that more data equals more clarity.
Right. More is always better.
Exactly. But in statistics, there's this threshold where an abundance of information just becomes, a blinding whiteout. The warning signs don't disappear. They become completely indistinguishable from the background noise.
Which brings us to the exact center of today's deep dive.
Okay.
We're cracking open a U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation's interim report. This was published in April 2026. The title is Unmasked: How Biden health officials purposely turned a blind eye toward COVID-19 vaccine safety signals.
Now, before we get into the actual mechanisms of this report, we really have to pause and lay out some very clear ground rules for how we are going to approach this.
Absolutely we do. Listener, if you just heard that title, you probably immediately felt your blood pressure shift, in one direction or the other. We have to acknowledge the elephant in the room here. This is a highly charged congressional report.
Very charged.
Right. It contains these scathing allegations pointing fingers at prominent left-wing and right-wing political figures, and it touches on, honestly, one of the most polarizing public health events of the modern era. But today, we are leaving the politics at the door.
Completely.
We're not here to endorse the political framing of the authors, nor are we, taking sides in the broader societal debate.
Right. Our mission today is strictly analytical and impartial. We are focusing exclusively on the raw materials presented in these pages. We want to understand the statistical methodologies being debated, the mathematics behind the data mining, and the internal institutional communications.
The actual emails.
Yeah, the literal emails that reveal how a massive bureaucracy processes really complex, conflicting information.
So we're essentially acting as forensic accountants, but for data science and bureaucratic behavior.
I like that, yeah. Forensic data accountants.
Right. We want to know how the machine was built, how it operated under extreme stress, and what happened when the people who built the machine basically said, hey, it's malfunctioning.
Yeah.
So let's start by looking at the FDA's early warning system. Because if you're the Food and Drug Administration and you need to monitor the safety of a medical product that has just been given to, hundreds of millions of people, you can't exactly just call everyone up and ask how they're feeling.
No, you need a massive surveillance net.
Right.
And the foundational layer of that net here in the United States is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. Most people just call it VAER.
Big ears.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it is co-managed by the CDC and the FDA. Now, it's really crucial to understand what VAERS is and, what it isn't. It is a spontaneous passive surveillance system.
Passive being the operative word there.
Yeah.
Right.
Precisely. Because active surveillance would be the FDA, say, proactively reaching out to a controlled cohort of patients every week to take their vitals.
Right. Checking in on them.
Yeah. Passive surveillance means the database just sits there waiting for input. So if you get a vaccine and experience a symptom, and anything from a mild fever to a severe cardiac event, you, your doctor, or even a family member can just log onto the website and submit a report.
Which means it's a remarkably messy database. It is unverified by nature.
Extremely messy.
Someone could report that a vaccine made their arm sore, and someone else could literally report that it made them grow a third ear.
Yeah. The noise-to-signal ratio is astronomical. You have millions of reports, and many of them are just coincidental health events that would have happened to the person regardless of whether they received a medical product at all, because, people get sick every day.
Right.
So the challenge for the FDA isn't really collecting the reports. The challenge is sifting through this mountain of unstructured, noisy data to find an actual statistically significant signal. A signal that indicates a specific product is causing a specific problem at a higher rate than normal.
It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, but the haystack is the size of Texas.
Exactly.
And half the things that look like needles are actually just very sharp pieces of straw.
That's a perfect way to put it. You need a tool to sort it.
Yeah.
And going into 2021, the FDA and CDC were, frankly, very confident they had the ultimate tool for this. In their official operating procedures, a senior CDC official actually referred to their specific data mining method as the gold standard.
The gold standard. Okay, so what is this gold standard?
The mathematical engine driving it is a technique called empirical Bayesian data mining. To get really specific, the algorithm the FDA relied on is a 20-year-old system called the multi-item gamma Poisson shrinker, or MGPS for short.
Okay, wow. We just hit the listener with some very heavy statistical jargon.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's good. Multi-item gamma Poisson shrinker.
Yeah.
But let's break down the hood of this car and look at the engine. How does Bayesian data mining actually work in this specific context?
Okay, so at its core, Bayesian statistics is all about updating your beliefs based on new evidence. You start with what's called a prior probability, basically what you expect the baseline rate of an event to be.
Okay.
Then you introduce new data, and you get a posterior probability. So in the context of MGPS, the system is constantly comparing the observed number of adverse events for a specific vaccine against the expected number of events, based on all the other data in the entire VAERS database.
Yeah. Okay, let me try an analogy here to see if I'm tracking. Imagine you're standing on the tarmac of a busy international airport, right? And you're trying to figure out if the engine on a specific baggage cart is malfunctioning and making this loud, grinding noise. If you just measure the decibels of the cart on its own, it might seem loud, but the algorithm's job is to compare the cart's noise to the ambient noise of the entire airport. It measures the cart against the jets taking off, the sirens, the wind.
That's actually a really good start, yeah. But we need to factor in the Poisson and the shrinker parts of the algorithm, because that's where the math gets really clever and eventually really problematic.
Oh, okay. Let's hear it.
So the Poisson distribution is a mathematical concept used to model the probability of a given number of events happening in a fixed interval of time or space. It's particularly useful for modeling rare events.
Like getting struck by lightning.
Yeah.
Or experiencing a severe neurological reaction to a routine medication.
Yes, exactly. But when you are dealing with millions of reports, sometimes a really small sample size can throw off a massive false alarm.
Right.
Let's say a brand new, highly specialized vaccine is given to only 10 people. One of them happens to suffer a heart attack the next day. A crude mathematical ratio would look at that and say, well, this vaccine has a 10% heart attack rate. Panic.
But logically, we know a sample size of 10 is way too small to draw a definitive conclusion from. It could literally just be terrible luck.
Exactly, and this is where the shrinker function of the MGPS comes in. Statistical shrinkage is a technique that takes those extreme values, like our hypothetical 10% heart attack rate, and pulls them, or shrinks them, back toward the baseline average.
Because the algorithm recognizes the sample size is too small to be trustworthy.
Yes. It assumes the extreme rate is probably a fluke. Now, as more data comes in, if the heart attack rate actually stays high as thousands of people take it, the algorithm eventually stops shrinking it, and the safety signal officially triggers. It's a mathematically elegant way to prevent false positives and avoid causing a public panic over statistical anomalies.
Okay, that makes sense. So the MGPS is designed to act as a very cautious, very deliberate filter. It really doesn't want to ring the fire alarm unless it is absolutely mathematically certain there is smoke.
Precisely. And for 20 years, when it was looking at standard seasonal vaccines, it functioned exactly as intended.
Because it had a diverse data set, right?
Yeah, it functioned well when the database contained a vast diversity of products. Flu shots, measles, mumps, rubella, HPV vaccines. That diversity is what established a stable, reliable baseline of normal adverse events.
Normal background noise at the airport.
Right.
But the Senate report outlines a fatal mathematical flaw in this gold standard when it collided with the reality of the pandemic.
Yeah.
A phenomenon they call masking. And to understand masking, we really have to look at what happened to the VAER's database in 2021.
Oh, it was a data flood of unprecedented proportions.
Hmm.
According to the report, in 2021, an overwhelming 99% of all reports submitted to the VAER's database were for COVID-19 vaccines.
99%.
Yes, the sheer volume fundamentally altered the entire ecosystem of the database.
Which means our baseline completely shifted. The report actually uses this incredible analogy to make this concrete, and I really want to share it with the listener because it blew my mind.
It's a great analogy. Go for it.
So imagine you are tasked with testing the toxicity of a relatively rare poison, say hemlock. To mathematically prove hemlock is dangerous, you need a baseline of normal to compare it against. Under normal circumstances, you'd compare hemlock to something harmless, like saline solution. If hemlock causes cellular death and saline doesn't, boom, you have a massive statistical anomaly, a clear safety signal.
Right, the math would basically scream at you to pay attention.
Exactly. But what if your baseline for normal is suddenly polluted? What if, instead of saline, your baseline is heavily flooded with data from arsenic poisoning?
Both are deadly.
Right. Both hemlock and arsenic are incredibly deadly. But if you test the toxicity of hemlock against a baseline that is artificially inflated by the toxicity of arsenic, hemlock is no longer going to look like a statistical anomaly.
It just blends right in.
Yes. Relative to the new toxic baseline, the hemlock looks completely normal.
It's a brilliant way to visualize the masking effect. So let's map that back to the actual FDA data parameters that are detailed in the report. When the algorithm was looking for a safety signal for, let's say, the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine, it didn't compare the Moderna data against a baseline of historical flu shots. It compared Moderna against a baseline that was overwhelmingly comprised of adverse event reports from the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine.
So if multiple COVID-19 vaccines are causing a similar elevated rate of a specific adverse event, the algorithm effectively blinds itself.
It completely cancels the signal out. I mean, let's use the hypothetical numbers from the report to illustrate the sheer scale of this mathematical illusion. Imagine a scenario where there are 100,000 severe adverse events reported for the Moderna vaccine. In any normal year, 100,000 reports for a single product would completely break the system. Alarms would be blaring in every single corridor of the FDA.
Oh, you would expect emergency press conferences immediately.
But the MGPS algorithm operates on comparison, remember. It takes those 100,000 Moderna reports and tests them against the baseline. If the baseline happens to contain 100,000 severe events reported for the Pfizer vaccine, plus merely, say, 10,000 events from all other traditional non-COVID vaccines combined, the math breaks down.
Wow.
The Moderna numbers don't stand out. The true rate of adverse events for one product is entirely drowned out because the comparator group is flooded with similar products experiencing similarly high rates. The signal isn't just diminished, it is entirely masked.
That is wild. The algorithm looks at the data, performs its very elegant, cautious Bayesian shrinkage, and just concludes, well, the Pfizer data looks exactly the same, so this must just be the new normal, nothing to see here, please remain calm.
Yeah, and we really need to be very clear about something here. This was not some mysterious, unforeseeable glitch. The statistical community, including the FDA's own internal experts, fully understood that masking was a built-in limitation of the MGPS algorithm. The FDA had established a very strict threshold for what officially constituted a safety signal. They relied on a metric called the EB05.
EB05, okay. What is that?
It's the lower bound of the 90% confidence interval for the reporting ratio. Basically, for a signal to trigger an official review, the EB05 score had to exceed 2.0.
Meaning the adverse event had to be occurring at more than double the expected baseline rate.
Correct. But because the baseline was so heavily flooded with COVID-19 data, reaching that 2.0 threshold became a mathematical impossibility for any side effect that was shared across the different COVID vaccines. The threshold was artificially, albeit unintentionally, raised so high by the raw volume of data that the early warning system was effectively deactivated for shared adverse events.
So we have a gold standard tool that fundamentally breaks when you feed it too much of the same kind of data. I mean, we're flying a plane and the altimeter just stopped working because there are too many clouds.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But identifying a mechanical failure is really only half the battle. If the FDA's massive surveillance apparatus had a known blind spot, the most pressing question becomes, did anyone actually have a fix? Because it's one thing to point at a leaking roof and complain, right? It's an entirely different thing to show up on the roof with fresh shingles, a hammer, and the architectural blueprints.
Right, exactly.
And that brings us to a fascinating clash of methodologies and the whistleblowers who actually tried to fix the machine.
Yes, and the cast of characters outlined in the Senate report is what makes the story so compelling, because we aren't talking about, outside critics or fringe academics throwing stones at the agency. We are talking about the architects themselves.
The insiders.
Right. The report centers around two key figures. The first is Dr. Anna Sarfman.
And what is her pedigree? Because she's not just a random analyst, right?
Oh, her pedigree is impeccable. Dr. Zarfman was a highly decorated senior medical officer and a leading safety data mining developer working inside the FDA. In fact, if you look at the agency's own historical records, she is credited as the person who helped develop and implement the original MGPS data mining system that the FDA was currently relying on.
Wait, she helped build the broken system?
Yes. She literally won agency awards for this specific work back in 2002. She knows the tool better than almost anyone because she helped build it.
Okay, so she is the ultimate insider. And who is the second figure?
The second figure is Dr. William Dumusel. Now, at the time of these events, he was the chief statistician at Oracle, but his relevance goes much deeper than that. Dr. Dumusel is the mathematician who literally invented the MGPS algorithm back in 1999. The entire FDA pharmacovigilance apparatus is built on his underlying mathematics.
That is just, it's wild. The FDA is relying on a statistical engine. The engine is breaking under the weight of pandemic data. And the two people ringing the alarm bell are the inventor of the engine and the FDA mechanic who installed it.
Exactly. And Dr. Dumusel hadn't just rested on his laurels since 1999. He recognized the limitations of his original algorithm, particularly its vulnerability to masking. Over the intervening years, he actually developed an updated, evolved algorithm. Dr. Sarfman referred to it in internal communications as the superior model. It was called RGPS, which stands for Regression-Adjusted Gamma-Poisson Shrinker.
Okay, another massive statistical term, regression-adjusted gamma-Poisson shrinker. How does RGPS actually fix the masking problem? What does regression adjustment do that the old system just couldn't?
So regression adjustment is a really powerful statistical technique. It's used to isolate the relationship between a specific cause and a specific effect by mathematically holding all other potential factors constant. Think of it as a highly sophisticated digital filter.
Okay, let me see if I can visualize this one. Imagine you're working in a music studio, staring at a massive mixing board with 100 different volume sliders.
Okay.
The old system, MGPS, is basically just looking at the master volume output. If the master volume is loud, it can't really tell if it's the drums, the bass, or the vocals causing the spike, especially if they're all playing loudly at the exact same time. The signal is just mashed together.
That's a great way to think about the confounding variables, yeah.
So what does RGPS do? Does it go in and individually adjust the sliders?
It does something even better. It mathematically isolates the individual tracks. Unlike MGPS, RGPS actively models the effects of multiple covariates like age, gender, underlying health conditions, and, most importantly, the presence of other similar vaccines. And it models them simultaneously. It automatically adjusts for these confounding variables, which dramatically reduces false positives. And crucially, it automatically unmasks hidden signals by recalculating the baseline after stripping away the distorting influence of the flooded data. It essentially builds a clean, hypothetical baseline to test the data against.
Okay, so it basically puts on noise-canceling headphones, tunes out the arsenic, and lets you hear the hemlock clearly.
Yes.
So in early 2021, right as the largest vaccine rollout in human history is accelerating and the VRE's database is just getting absolutely slammed with reports, Dr. Sarfman takes this state-of-the-art RGPS tool, seeds the raw VRE's data into it, and looks at what the old system is missing. And the results are, well, they're staggering.
The efficacy differences between the two models are literally night and day. When Dr. Zarfman and Dr. Dumusel ran the numbers using the RGPS methodology, the report states they uncovered 49 examples of extreme masking.
49 instances where the FDA's early warning system was completely blinded by the math.
Yes. When they stripped away the mathematical mask, the clinical picture looked completely different. The new algorithm suddenly illuminated roughly 25 statistically significant safety signals for adverse events associated with the COVID-19 vaccines, events that were currently failing to meet the FDA's rigid 2.0 threshold under the old methodology.
25 separate safety signals. What kind of medical events are we talking about here? Because, a signal could just be a mild rash, right?
No, they were not mild. The report details severe, life-altering, and life-threatening conditions. The RGPS model flagged sudden cardiac death. It flagged Bell's palsy, which is a condition that causes sudden temporary weakness or paralysis of the muscles on one side of the face. It flagged pulmonary infarction.
Just to clarify for the listener, a pulmonary infarction is incredibly serious. It's when a section of your lung tissue actually dies because its blood supply is cut off, usually by a blood clot, like an embolus traveling to the lungs.
Exactly. And as the months progressed and they ran more data, the masked signals continued to accumulate. The RGPS found hidden signals for acute myocardial infarction, which is a major heart attack associated with both the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. It found non-site-specific embolism and thrombosis, which are dangerous blood clots associated with the Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer vaccines. It flagged dementia associated with Pfizer. And perhaps most disturbingly, it flagged a very stark signal categorized quite simply as death and sudden death.
Wow. But hold on, though. I have to step in here and challenge this premise just a bit.
Yeah.
Because it's early 2021. The pandemic is raging. Hospitals are overflowing. The global economy is teetering. The vaccines are rolling out under emergency use authorizations. From a pure crisis management perspective, wouldn't swapping out your core national surveillance algorithm in the middle of a global emergency be incredibly reckless? I mean, you don't rediff the engine of the airplane while you are at 30,000 feet. Isn't the FDA somewhat justified in looking at this new tool and saying, look, we just don't have time to validate this right now?
It's a very rational defense. And it's actually the exact defense that an FDA official articulated later on. They argued that it would be highly problematic to rely on a, quote, brand new, possibly unvalidated tool in the context of an EUA. And on the surface, that sounds like prudent bureaucratic management.
I hear a but.
But when we dive into the context provided in the report, the irony becomes glaring. This was not a brand new tool hastily sketched on a napkin to capitalize on the pandemic. Dr. Dumichel first published the foundational white paper on RGPS back in 2012. It had been in the statistical literature for nearly a decade. Furthermore, the FDA officials themselves privately acknowledged that they were completely out of their depth compared to Dr. Sarfman.
Wait, they admitted she was the expert.
Explicitly.
Yeah.
In internal emails, an FDA official named Dr. Bethany Baer wrote to a colleague regarding Dr. Sarfman's data, stating quite plainly, and I quote, "I know that she knows a lot more about data mining than I do."
So, the people enforcing the use of the old broken algorithm openly admit they understand the math less than the person offering the fix.
Precisely. They acknowledged her expertise. They knew she helped build the system they were currently using. They recognized the mathematical limitations of that system, yet they stubbornly refused to adopt the state-of-the-art solution she was presenting.
Which brings us to the most human element of this entire saga. I mean, we've established the data, the flaw, and the mathematical advantage of the solution. But data doesn't move on its own. People have to act on it.
Right.
How did the FDA, as an institution, respond when their own top experts brought this blazing red warning light right to their doorstep? To answer that, we really need to trace the exact chronological timeline of these ignored warnings. Let's look at the paper trail.
Yeah, the timeline detailed in the report is methodical, and it paints a picture of a bureaucracy increasingly agitated by internal dissent. It begins formally on March 1st, 2021. Dr. Sarfman manages to secure a briefing with Dr. Peter Marks. He is the director of the FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, commonly known as CBER. CBER is the division directly responsible for vaccine oversight.
So she goes straight to the top of the relevant command chain.
Yes. She presents a detailed slide deck. The presentation explicitly argues that the current MGPS method is, quote, not state-of-the-art, and she meticulously demonstrates how the RGPS algorithm can solve the masking issue.
Okay, and how does he take it?
Well, Dr. Marks's initial response is typical of high-level management. He thanks her, states they will work through the issues, and suggests scheduling follow-up meetings with his safety team.
Sounds like a standard, reasonably productive start. She flagged an issue, management acknowledged it, but where does it go from there?
On March 26th, Dr. Sarfman delivers the hard evidence. She emails the top FDA officials the spreadsheet detailing those 49 examples of extreme masking and the 25 hidden safety signals, including the severe cardiac and thrombotic events.
Oh boy. This is the moment where the rubber meets the road. She has moved from theoretical math to actual disturbing medical signals.
And this is exactly when the institutional evasion begins. As we move into April 2021, Dr. Sarfman continues to run the data with Dr. Dumichel and sends updated findings. But the internal emails from the FDA officials show they aren't dedicating their time to investigating the myocardial infarctions or the pulmonary embolism she flagged. Instead, they are trying to figure out how to manage Dr. Sarfman.
Wow. They're managing the messenger, not the message.
Exactly. On April 15th, an official within the safety division, Dr. David Menshik, writes an email to his colleagues that is deeply revealing of the internal culture. He writes, quote, Before we potentially reach out to Anna, we should meet internally many considerations not suited to email.
Wow, many considerations not suited to email. I mean, anyone who has ever worked in a massive corporate or government bureaucracy knows exactly what that phrase means.
Oh, yeah.
It means do not create a discoverable paper trail of what we are about to discuss.
Hmm.
It implies that the priorities driving the decision-making process are not something you want recorded in the official archives.
It strongly suggests a desire to control the narrative privately, and this avoidance strategy escalates rapidly. Because Dr. Sarfman is relentless. On May 6th, she circulates new data specifically highlighting high mask signals for acute myocardial infarction.
Heart attacks.
Yep.
She is saying, look, the data says people are having heart attacks.
Yes, and the response is swift and honestly draconian. The very next day, May 7th, top CBER officials, including Dr. Menchik, draft and send an email to Dr. Sarfman. It is essentially a gag order. They explicitly direct her to, quote, please hold off on creating and sending data mining reports and analyses.
Wait, they literally ordered the agency's top safety data expert to stop looking at the safety data.
They did.
It's breathtaking.
Yeah.
Did she comply?
She did not. She believed the public health implications were just too massive to ignore. Moving into June and July of 2021, she continues her analysis, even collaborating on a formal paper with Dr. Dumerchel to outline the masking problem for the broader scientific community. And then on July 12th, she drops the heaviest bombshell yet. She emails FDA officials alerting them that the RGPS method has detected an increased mortality signal with the COVID-19 vaccines. The new math has uncovered a signal for death and sudden death that was remaining completely obscured by the old MGPS methodology.
Just to pause on that.
Yeah.
She is sending official internal correspondence saying, my math shows a hidden signal for sudden death. You would think that email would trigger a 5-alarm fire drill within the agency. You would think every available statistician would be pulled into a room to either definitively debunk her math or immediately alert the public.
The reaction was the exact opposite. The response was to escalate their administrative complaints against her. This administrative hostility culminates a few months later, on September 15, 2021. Dr. Peter Marks, the high-level CBER director she briefed back in March, formally escalates the issue. He complains directly to Dr. Zarfman's superior. He explicitly states that Dr. Zarfman has been asked to cease and desist because her persistent emails and data reports have become a, quote, major distraction.
A major distraction. Looking at this timeline, it is genuinely hard to fathom. I mean, instead of spending those critical 6 months poring over the hidden data regarding heart attacks, blood clots, and mortality, the agency spent 6 months orchestrating a bureaucratic blockade against the person bringing them the data. They treated a highly credentialed early warning system like a mosquito buzzing in their ear.
It reveals a dangerous inversion of priorities. The institutional focus shifted from the potential discovery of medical risk to the enforcement of procedural compliance.
Right. Which forces us to ask, why? What was the internal logic driving these highly educated, dedicated public servants to build this wall of silence? Because they aren't villains in a movie, they are scientists and administrators.
Right.
And the Senate report actually spends a significant amount of time unpacking this internal resistance, and it goes way beyond just stubbornness or laziness. It dives into deep-seated bureaucratic self-preservation. Let's look at the cultural forces at play here.
Yeah, the first major force is a structural turf war. The FDA is a massive, sprawling entity, and like any massive bureaucracy, it is heavily siloed. Dr. Zarfman was employed by CDER, which stands for the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research.
Okay, so she evaluates drugs, pharmaceuticals.
Yes. But vaccine surveillance belongs entirely to a different division, CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. And there is a distinct cultural and administrative divide between these centers. They have different mandates, different leadership structures, and often a fierce sense of territoriality.
It's the classic, this isn't your department argument. It's like the FBI telling the CIA to stay off their lawn, even though they are both supposed to be fighting the exact same threat.
Precisely. Throughout the internal communications, CBER officials repeatedly complain that Dr. Sarfman is out of her lane. They demand that she stick to her assigned work. They prioritize the organizational hierarchy over her undisputed, decades-long expertise in pharmacovigilance data mining. The fact that she possessed the exact tool needed to fix the broken system didn't matter as much as the fact that her desk was in the wrong building.
That is institutional siloing at its absolute worst. But it wasn't just a turf war over who gets to do the math, was it? There was a much darker, much more pervasive fear driving the leadership, and it had everything to do with public relations.
Right. And this is where we return to that September 15th email from Dr. Peter Marks, where he asks Dr. Sarfman's boss to make her cease and desist. In that email, Dr. Marks gives a very specific written justification for shutting her down. He states that her strategy could, quote, create erroneous conflicts that feed into anti-vaccination rhetoric.
Wow. That one sentence might be the most revealing piece of evidence in the entire report. Feed into anti-vaccination rhetoric.
It is incredibly revealing. It implies that the agency's leadership was actively weighing the optics of the safety data against the reality of the safety data. They appeared to prioritize the public relations narrative, the need to maintain unquestioning public confidence in the vaccine rollout over the rigorous internal investigation of severe safety signals.
They were so terrified of how the public might misuse the data or how bad actors might weaponize the data that they decided the safest route was to just ignore the data entirely. They shut down a highly credentialed internal scientist because her findings were politically inconvenient for the broader public health messaging. It is essentially treating the American public like children who cannot be trusted with complex, evolving medical realities.
And what makes this dynamic so deeply troubling is that the internal emails prove they didn't dismiss Dr. Sarfman because they thought her math was wrong. The report outlines how, privately, the FDA officials acknowledged that she was entirely correct about the masking flaw.
They knew the ship was taking on water. They just didn't want anyone pointing at the hole.
Yes. In September 2021, right around the time Dr. Marks is issuing the cease and desist, Dr. Menchik, the same official who helped draft the gag order back in May, was actually working on a draft article about mRNA vaccine safety for a medical journal. In his initial draft, he explicitly wrote that the FDA's data mining scores could be, quote, muted by COVID-19 vaccine reports contributing substantially to the comparator group.
Wait, he literally wrote out the exact definition of masking. He admitted the baseline was distorted.
He did. He acknowledged the exact limitation Dr. Sarfman had been screaming about for 6 months.
And let me guess, did that sentence make it into the final publication?
It did not. That text was systematically scrubbed before the final article was published in The Lancet in early 2022. The public-facing science was sanitized, but the private admissions continued long after the fact. Fast forward to October 2023, and another top FDA official, Dr. Narayan Nair, explicitly admitted the truth in an email to his colleagues at the CDC. Discussing the masking issue, he wrote, quote, we were aware of this limitation before and during the pandemic.
We were aware of this limitation before and during the pandemic. They knew the gold standard was flawed the entire time. They knew the early warning system was essentially turned off for shared adverse events. But instead of deploying the RGPS fix, the report outlines how they actively shifted their efforts toward hiding the methodology from outside scrutiny entirely.
Yeah, the progression from internal suppression to external evasion is stark. In August 2021, internal emails from Dr. Menchik note a plan to deliberately limit the distribution of their data mining reports, citing vague data security reasons. But the real crisis of transparency hits in the summer of 2022.
What happens in July 2022?
The external pressure finally breaches the hull. Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, requests were piling up from various public interest groups, legally demanding to see the raw EB data mining analyses that the FDA was using. On top of that, Senator Ron Johnson was sending formal congressional inquiries demanding the exact same safety data.
For the listener who might not be familiar with the mechanics of FOIA, it is a federal law that requires agencies to release requested information unless it falls under very specific, narrow exemptions. It is the primary legal mechanism the public has to force transparency. When FOIAs pile up, agency lawyers get very, very nervous because withholding documents illegally can lead to massive lawsuits. So the FDA is getting squeezed legally and politically. How do they respond?
Right as the pressure peaks, on July 12, 2022, the FDA takes a drastic step. They simply stop sending the weekly data mining reports to the CDC altogether.
Wait, they just severed the data pipeline to their primary partner agency. The CDC is relying on that data to formulate national health guidelines, and the FDA just cuts them off.
Completely cuts them off. And the motivation for this becomes clear a few months later. In November 2022, an internal email from a CDC official trying to understand why they are no longer receiving the reports literally hypothesizes that the FDA stopped sending them because of the FOIAs.
It is a stunning evasion of accountability. They essentially calculated that if they stop circulating the reports internally, there are fewer documents to be discovered and released via the Freedom of Information Act. They broke the internal communication pipeline to avoid external legal scrutiny.
It's the ultimate manifestation of bureaucratic self-preservation overriding public health transparency.
Which brings us to the most sobering part of this deep dive. I mean, we can talk about statistical algorithms and Bayesian shrinkage and bureaucratic turf wars all day, but data on a spreadsheet isn't just abstract numbers. An intentionally masked safety signal translates to real bodies in hospital beds. What did this months-long bureaucratic suppression actually mean for the public?
It meant a fundamental failure to provide informed consent to the American public. And the most prominent and heartbreaking example detailed in the report revolves around myocarditis.
Let's clearly define that for the listener. What is myocarditis and why is it so dangerous?
Myocarditis is inflammation of the heart muscle, the myocardium. It can reduce the heart's ability to pump blood and can cause rapid or abnormal heart rhythms, known as arrhythmias. In severe cases, it can cause sudden cardiac arrest. Related to that is pericarditis, which is inflammation of the tissue surrounding the heart. When they occur together, it's myopericarditis. It is a serious, potentially life-threatening cardiac event, particularly when it occurs in young, otherwise healthy individuals.
And how does the timeline of the FDA's knowledge of myocarditis match up with what they were telling the public?
Well, as we discussed, Dr. Sarfman, using the state-of-the-art RGPS method, found severe cardiac signals months earlier than the FDA publicly acknowledged. She was sending urgent emails highlighting acute myocardial infarction signals in early May of 2021. Furthermore, the report references draft notes from a federal health meeting on May 24, 2021. In those private notes, officials openly admitted that the VA-ERS database was already signaling for myopericarditis, specifically in the 16 to 24 age group.
So by late May, they know internally that young people are experiencing heart inflammation at statistically concerning rates.
Yes, but the FDA did not issue a formal warning label change for the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines regarding myocarditis risks until June 25, 2021.
Yeah, as a one-month delay. During the absolute peak frenzy of the vaccine rollout, that is a massive, massive window of time.
It is a critical blind spot. You really have to ask the question, how many millions of young people, how many healthy teenagers and young adults received the vaccine during that late May to late June window without their doctors knowing about the cardiac risks? How many parents took their teenagers to pharmacies without the ability to make a fully informed choice because the regulatory agency decided to manage the data rather than release it?
The failure to act on the unmasked data meant the public was flying completely blind. Informed consent requires actual information. If the FDA holds the information in a silo because they are afraid of anti-vax rhetoric, they are stripping the patient of their right to bodily autonomy. And the report notes that myocarditis wasn't an isolated incident, right? The system failed again later in the rollout.
Yes, the masking problem persisted. The report highlights a subsequent failure regarding the bivalent boosters in early 2023. By this point, the database was so saturated that occasionally a signal for a certain adverse event became so loud, so prevalent, that it actually overcame the masking effect entirely. The signal broke through the distorted baseline through sheer brute force.
Not the broken baggage card engine eventually getting so loud you can hear it over a Boeing 747 taking off.
Exactly. This happened with ischemic stroke, which is a life-threatening blood clot in the brain in individuals aged 65 and older following the Pfizer bivalent booster. The old MGPS system actually managed to flag it. The alarms went off. But even then, according to the report, Biden health officials still failed to immediately issue formal widespread public warnings about the potential risks to the elderly population.
It paints a picture of an agency paralyzed by its own narrative. Whether the algorithm failed to see the signal or the algorithm succeeded in seeing the signal, the bureaucratic response was identical. Silence, delay, management of optics, and let's not forget the sheer volume of severe signals Dr. Sarfman found that were masked for months. Thrombosis, Bell's palsy, pulmonary infarction, dementia. Because the FDA rigidly refused to implement a state-of-the-art statistical system that accounted for masking, they were fundamentally, mathematically unable to accurately assess the safety profile of a medical product they were administering to hundreds of millions of people.
And this strikes at the very core of what public health is supposed to be. Everyone in the epidemiological field knows that passive surveillance systems like VA-ERS are inherently flawed. They capture a massive amount of noise. But when a federal regulatory agency is presented with the absolute best available mathematical lens to filter that noise and view the data clearly, a lens presented by the very experts who built their infrastructure, and they refuse to look through it because of internal turf wars and public relations fears, they compromise the single most important currency in medicine.
Which is trust.
Exactly. Trust is the foundation of public health. If the public doesn't trust the institutions cannot govern during a crisis. Once the public realizes, through congressional reports and internal emails, that an agency is more concerned with managing the political narrative than unmasking the raw data, that trust is shattered. And it takes decades, sometimes generations, to rebuild.
It is a heavy, heavy realization to sit with. So, as we reach the end of this incredibly dense, deep dive, let's briefly look back at the ground we've covered. We started with a known mathematical blind spot, a statistical phenomenon called masking, that effectively ground out severe safety signals by inflating the baseline with millions of similar reports. We met two undisputed inside experts, Dr. Zarfman and Dr. Dumuschel, who brought a state-of-the-art solution, the RGPS algorithm, directly to FDA leadership to fix the flaw. And we watched through a chronological paper trail of internal emails as a massive bureaucracy chose to shut down the messengers, gag the experts, and eventually hide the data from other agencies entirely rather than unmask the truth. And the cost of that bureaucratic suppression was delayed warnings for severe conditions like myocarditis and ischemic stroke.
It's a sobering forensic look at how institutional priorities can warp under pressure, and I think it leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought to mull over, one that stretches far beyond the FDA or vaccines.
I'm all ears.
We've spent this entire hour looking at how a massive volume of data can actually be used to hide the truth. We looked at how a specific statistical algorithm broke under the weight of an unprecedented event, allowing severe anomalies to blend in as normal. But think about the broader implications of this phenomenon for our modern digital age. We rely increasingly on algorithms, machine learning, and artificial intelligence to filter almost everything in our lives. Our medical records, our financial transactions, our credit scores, our societal data, our news feeds.
Right. Everything is run through a mathematical filter to tell us what is important and what isn't.
Precisely. But who is monitoring the baseline for those algorithms? If a system is designed to only alert us to anomalies, but the anomaly itself slowly becomes the new baseline because of a flood of distorted data, the system goes blind. How many other critical warnings in our society right now, in our economy, in our environment, in our infrastructure, are currently being masked by the deafening everyday noise of the data flood?
Wow. That is a deeply unsettling question. What else is blending in because our baseline is fundamentally broken? Who is checking the math on the machines that run our world? Listener, thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense, deep dive. It's a lot to process, but these are the conversations we have to have. As always, keep reading, keep challenging the consensus, and never stop asking the hard questions about the data behind the headlines. Until next time.